Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome from wherever you are. I'm Alvin Mrowa. My academic background is in development economics from Mackay University. I am a member of Open Economics Uganda, a youth-led organization that aims to promote the advancement of economic knowledge and understanding among its youth and bridge the gap between economic theory and its application in solving real-life economic problems. Open Economics is organizing this event together with Mackay University Economic Society, a society that brings together all students of economics at the university. Before I go further, I would like to thank our partners that have made this possible. Those are Exploring Economics, the Protestant Academy of Turing, and the Ball Foundation. So today we are going to have a discussion on the topic, the state of Uganda's economy in the eyes of young economists. So, and we have a panel of young, experienced economists who are going to guide this discussion as we move forward. Now, a small background about this topic. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a significant impact on Uganda's economy, and not just Uganda's economy, but many economies across the world. Following the measures that were taken by government to slow down the spread of the virus, which included a total shutdown of the economy, among other standards operating procedures, many businesses and many sectors of the economy were affected. And this had adverse effects on individuals, jobs. Currently, we've seen a number of multinationals closing in Uganda, AfriCell, and quite a number of others like ShopRite. Recently, we've had reports that Mogas, one of the oil giants in Uganda, is going under receivership. So those are some of the things that appear in the media, but there are also other smaller businesses and other smaller stories that may not appear. So that shows how the economy has been adversely affected. So to go through this discussion, I'm going to introduce the panelists today, and the first one is, as I go on, I'd like to ask you to mute yourselves so that we can avoid these echoes coming through. Thank you. The first panelist is Mr. Hannington Damulira. Hannington is a development economist dedicated to improving and advancing evidence-based public policy to come up with interventions that work for people and give value for money. With the 5 years of combined experience in leadership and coordination on roles, providing high-level strategic advance and advocacy in both public and private sectors, he has accumulated experience in development economics-related works and financial inclusion, with 2 years at the Uganda Bankers Association, where he worked as a communication and research assistant. During this time, sorry about that. So Hannington has worked, he has accumulated experience in development economics related works and financial inclusion, with 2 years at the Uganda Bankers Association, where he worked as a communications and research assistant. During this time, Huntington was part of the steering committee that was tasked with the establishment of the shared banking platform in Uganda with the help of consultative groups assisting the poor. Huntington has also worked as an aide to the executive director of the financial sector deepening Uganda, and in this role, he participated in the development of the 5-year strategy as well as coordinating the COVID-19 series. These studies were meant to assess the economic resilience of Uganda householders before and during COVID-19. Huntington is currently working with government of Uganda as a policy analyst, formulating evidence-based public policy through rigorous process like regulatory impact assessment, leading to evidence-based policies for frameworks. He has also participated in the third United Nations Universal Peer Review mechanism of human rights monitoring for Uganda. Huntington, you're welcome.
Thank you, Alvin.
Our second panelist is Mr. Enoch Will Nsubuga. He joined the Economic Policy Research Center in February 2020 as a young professional in the research department. He holds a Master's of Arts degree in economics and a Bachelor of Arts degree in development economics from Mackay University. His master's thesis of public debt sustainability, establishing the financial reaction function for Uganda from 1981-82 to 2016-2017, examined the sustainability of Uganda's public debt. He previously worked with the Economic Policy Research Center as a volunteer research associate, graduate intern, and an undergraduate intern. He has worked on the wide range of issues from public debt sustainability, economic determinants of unemployment in East Africa, the enabling environment of Uganda's labor market, and the Africa Central Free Trade Area and potential effects of the East African community countries, fiscal rules implementation in East Africa, and digital financial inclusion. He is an author of or a co-author of several reports, articles, blogs, and commentaries of aforementioned issues. Mr. Wilime received a Emeritus Young Professional Award of Mackay University and Economic Policy Research Center in 2020 as the Best Masters of Arts in Economics student. He is a member of the Uganda Economic Association. His research interests are in public economics, public finance, health economics, macroeconomics, trade, and regional integration. Enoch, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. Greetings from Palisa district. You're all welcome to visit us sometime.
Yes. Now, as we go ahead in this discussion, I'd like to invite Huntington to give us a brief review of what he thinks of the Ugandan economy.
Yes, thank you very much, Alvin, for the introduction, and to all the participants. Thank you for joining us in time. The event is being recorded, and for those that have missed whatever parts of the presentations or the discussion, the recording will be shared on our different platforms of Open Economies and also the one from Mackay. So, Alvin, I am having a problem. I don't seem to be able to share my screen. So the host had disabled the sharing function. So if you could put that up for me, then I can be able to share something small. Yes, as we are getting that fixed, I wanted to share the small slides that I have are mainly going to be about my perspective and the issues I am passionate about in the field of economics. I have mainly 3 issues that I would want to share with you, which is employment, the issue of financial inclusion and innovation, and then the 3rd issue will be on social inclusion. So my discussion is I'm aiming to get every participant or any other person that will eventually have a chance to listen to this okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, works well.
Okay, is it fine now?
It's very okay.
Okay, yes, so the slides that I have, like I was saying, I want to talk about employment, I want to talk about financial inclusion and innovation and social inclusion. So the reason why I chose these 3 topics, so we could have gone on and on about what I think about the economy or how I see the state of the economy currently, but I chose to talk about these 3 issues because I feel if there's youth participation, if there's youth involvement in these 3 categories or in these 3 issues, we shall have, progression, we shall have economic development, and then inclusion also of the youth. Because at the end of the day, in the future, this is the problems that we face now may very well be, or actually our problems to fix, and we have to come up with solutions that will enable us or that will help us to be able to do what, to propel this country forward in terms of what, of growth. So real briefly, I have, this away. Yes, so I have a small summary about, as you can see here, I started with employment. So I'm looking at the figures of employment, and I was looking at the discussion I was aiming at. We have, is employment, or is maybe we are looking at education. Is education part of the reasons we are not having employment levels, or is it because the business sustainability in Uganda is very low? Because if we are saying a study done in 2016 shows that a little over 2,500 formal jobs per year are advertised in Uganda. But you see, Ugandan people or Ugandan recruiters every year are not absorbing the capacity or are not absorbing the amount of people, the number of people that are seeking for jobs. So we want to see where does the mismatch come from? Does it come from the fact that the innovation or entrepreneurship or startup companies in Uganda is low and their sustainability and survival of businesses is not very hard, or the entry to the market is also an issue? Then we also understand, we have to understand the landscape of Uganda's employment sector. Where is it really related? Where does the relation come in from? Do the unemployment levels in Uganda, are they informed by the number of people graduating or the number of people passing through schools? Is it because people lack degrees? Is it people lack skills? Or people actually, we are not, there is no absorption for the current job seekers? And then when we talk about the second issue of financial inclusion, studies have showed, and there has been an establishment of facts that financial inclusion and economic growth are interrelated. So there's a correlation there. So we are saying that there's a study that was done in 2012 of the impact of financial inclusion on economic growth. Of course, we use the solo growth model, and I'm imagining everyone who did a little bit basics of economics, we can understand where this is coming from, that there's a 10% increase. If there's a 10% increase in financial inclusion, there's a potential to increase the income per worker by 1.3. So of course, that 1.3% increasing the income per worker will also translate into an increase in what? In aggregate demand, of course, and all its advantages. And then when we came to the issue of social inclusion, I believe that social inclusion is a topic that, or is a field, or is an idea that we have not yet embraced in the country. and it is quite disappointing because there are very many marginalized groups. When we talk about, okay, for example, let's talk about the refugees in the country. The refugees in the country, we keep saying we have over 1.5 million refugees in this country, but those are part of the marginalized groups and they're not included in the development. Whereas there are some efforts that have been, seen from the likes of Equity Bank with FSDU and putting together, financially including these refugee communities and host communities and providing interventions for such communities. They are still not being included in issues of development, in issues of the discussions in issue of legal system. They're not getting the basic legal system. They're not getting, social services, which is education, health. So you find that there's another group of people, the gender more so, more especially including the more especially the women. There's a challenge about socially including women. Of course, when we take a sample of the women that have progressed, whether it's financially or economically, it has been growing. But I think there is more that the government can do, and there is more that we as the youth can also do to make sure we do what? We integrate or we include the women in what? In development. It is also the people with disabilities. There are certain regulations, there are certain rules or laws that take care or facilitate the well-being of the people with disabilities. But for example, they say that if you construct a building, it has to have an access for people with disabilities. There should be a specialized parking for people with disabilities. Unfortunately, we have seen, very many buildings going up, very many construction sites going up without this kind of access. And so we saw during the recent climate conference, there was an official that wasn't able to attend the climate conference simply because the building that the conference was being hosted did not have access for people with disabilities. So we need to look at social inclusion, and we need to be intentional, both as government and in our different organizations, that we push agendas, we push interventions that socially include people. So like I was saying earlier, the issue of employment, I looked at two things. I looked at the role of education, like I was explaining earlier, the role of education in employment, and then I also looked at the functioning of the labor market. So the role of education says the importance of education in the workplace is generally acknowledged, notably by the construction of the development of skills that will be used in employment. Not only employment, but also in the part, the role education can play in the entrepreneurial space. Because most of this information that we get from the skills, some of the knowledge that we get can be used to start up the businesses. But of course, this conversation will not only be limited to the role of education, but also to the role of education and the functioning labor market, but it will also be extended to the relationship between, as you see, employment and entrepreneurship. Like I was saying earlier, the sustainability of these organizations, the sustainability of these startup companies have a role to play in the levels of the unemployment levels in the country. Then I also said that data suggests that graduates do not comprise of the bulk of the unemployed, or rather unemployed. And therefore, the recent narrative that the graduate skill mismatch is a fundamental source of youth employment crisis could be baseless. Someone could dismiss it. So in 2015, UBOS did a school to work transition study. 77% of the people aged 15 to 29, that's under 30, only completed primary level education or had not completed it at all. So the graduates and those with a total qualification made up 4.3% of that age group. So you see that there's a mismatch. We're trying to say that, you see, 77% did not complete. Of the 4%, of all those 4%, of all those 77%, only 4% actually went through and attained a tertiary qualification. So what happens? Is it that we are saying that all these 4.3% are employed? That is not the case. But also the remaining balance of around 72.6%, 72.7% are also what? Some of them have some sort of employment or income generating activity. It could be as part of it could be a business, or it could be some sort of employment, but that's generating income. Then we also say that as a result, it will be critical for the employment debate that recognizes to create labor possibilities and opportunities that appropriate with Uganda's youth ability. You see, when we talk about employment creation, when we talk about solving the unemployment issue in Uganda, it's either the youth in Uganda are unemployable, or the jobs that are available are not suitable for the what? Which is the same thing, are not suitable for the youth in Uganda. So we need to see how we work that from the point of training, there is a match that while you are training people to go into the workforce or into the labor force, there is the interventions or the kind of knowledge and skills that we are sharing are going to lead to employability. So when we look at the functioning of the labor markets, we look at the discriminations, we look at the historical restrictions that women from school are subject to, the kind of harassment, the sexual harassment or work sexual harassment challenges that we normally see. And so we need to also be intentional and create interventions that will be able to fix some of these rooted problems, not only at the workplace, but even in the process of attaining the skills and knowledge so that someone can be able to gain meaningful employment. So I will run through this very fast because I know but Alvin is soon giving me a time check reality. So when it comes to financial inclusion and innovation, my idea, I was looking at access and usage of these financial institutions. All of this presentation, I'll be happy to share it with Alvin to share with the participants, and then you can read through whatever figures or information that I put there. So I've already discussed, I've already shared that there's a positive correlation between financial inclusion and economic growth. So if we're saying if there's an uptake and there's an uptake and usage of these financial services are made available, services are cheap, services are reliable, services are fast, and they are accessible at every given level, we can comfortably say that we shall have some level of development or economic growth in the sector. So I had some information here. I got this analysis from FSDU. They did a study in 2018 using their FinScope study. And so here we have drivers of uptake in this in the figure that you see down below. We have what are the reasons that why do people actually seek for financial services? And to be specific, why do people open up bank accounts? So we looked at to save 37%, which is not a bad number compared to where we are. But when you look at those 37%, the number will significantly be low when you see the people that are receiving salaries, because the difference between the 26% and the 27%, because if you're saying 26% receive salaries, what is the guarantee that those that receive salaries through the bank accounts actually keep the money on the bank account? So there's no guarantee. So the number reduces. So the 37% may very well not include the people receiving their salaries. We have people who open up bank accounts to specifically pay school fees. But when it's school fees time, and that is at what? That is at around 15%. To keep money safe, now we need to drive up the safety of money. We need to drive it up. The percentage is still very low as of 2018. And you can see the other variables there. And then the usage itself, which channel did they use for the bank accounts? The bank branch, 73%. The ATM is 41%, mobile phone is 12%, the internet is 2%, and agent is 5%. So if 73% of the people that have bank accounts are using the bank branch and 41%, those numbers are still too high, which brings me to the point of innovation. We need to see to it that we innovate. We need to create an enabling environment for innovation so that we have we have very many ideas or innovations coming up to help people not only access money, but also to use the financial services, including accessing credit, including accessing insurance services. And it should be subsidized, it should be easy. So I know you can use smartphones, but also for the future phones, USSD is one of the ways you can access financial services. So when you look at here, the types of accounts used, of course, the bank accounts use the savings, like you saw earlier on, 37% save. So ideally, the number will still come up to 81% for people who are holding savings accounts. The people using the ATM cards, mostly probably you can say withdraw or deposits. Then current accounts are not very many. And then the loan uptake is also very low according to that FinScope study. So frequency of use, as you can see on the right, the frequency of use of these bank accounts also differs on the period. Is it every once a week, twice a week? So there are also challenges there, and we need to have interventions in that space. So, and all those interventions, of course, will lead us to what I was talking about earlier, innovation. And when it comes to financial inclusion, we shall be looking at digital financial inclusion. And digital financial inclusion will increase the uptake, will increase the uptake, usage, and also access to these financial services. But also we mustn't forget that digital financial inclusion introduces new market participants and allocates risks and roles. So some of the risks and disadvantages of digital financial inclusion, in as much as we are pushing for it, it has its challenges and its risks. We have facilitating crime. You've heard of the blockchain kind of technology and how Bitcoin is being used to facilitate crime. We have fraud and things like that. So someone can sit at their desk wherever they are, and they can be able to do what? They can be able to, commit acts of fraud. So my final presentation was, of course, on social inclusion. And this, like I was saying earlier on, the points I've shared on are for us to think more about, and so that we can, to tickle our brains to see what kind of sectors or what kind of aspects do we need to engage in, do we need to concentrate in as the youth, what do we need to acquaint ourselves, which kind of knowledge or which kind of skills do we need to get? Because this, like I mentioned, these are the problems that we are facing now, and they are very much our problems wherever you are. Tomorrow you'll be in a different position, or you'll be getting up interventions elsewhere to maybe increase inclusion in the economy or in participation of the economic activities. And if you do not have a firm foundation on some of these issues, you may not be able to deliver. So this thing, of course, when it comes to social inclusion, let me just give briefly because I am winding up. Social inclusion is a process of improving the terms on which individuals and groups of people take part in society, improving the ability, opportunity, and dignity of those that are disadvantaged. So you can see that if there's some sort of inclusion in economic participation, political participation, social participation, and everyday life of these marginalized groups that we are mentioning down here, maybe discrimination can be in it can be in form of gender, the age, the locality of occupation, sexual orientation, gender identity, amongst others. So these individuals, when they lose their dignity, they don't have the esteem, they cannot participate when it comes to also participating in economic activities, including productive ones that will increase resilience, their resilience, or to shocks, to economic shocks. It becomes an issue because they feel left out. Albinos are also one of the groups that we also need to include socially in our activity. So the idea is, what do we need to do? So in a study done by the World Bank, it says here that 75% of the Ugandan population is under the age of 30. What does that show us? That shows us that we are the majority, we have a lot of work to do, and we cannot afford to be complacent, and we cannot afford not to be involved in economic activities or in development activities of this country. We need to find a niche. We need to find areas in which we can participate, in which we can drive government to do better, in which we can drive ourselves to also do better, and also looking at all the challenges, the economic shocks. Of course, we have not talked or have not dwelled on the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is something, of course, we shall have in the discussion, but that has also been an issue. The COVID-19 pandemic, with all its restrictions, led to a shutdown of businesses. Very many youth who own businesses actually ran out of businesses, their business shut down. And so the interventions that we are creating right now, and the government needs to understand that, or needs to appreciate that the majority or the numbers of the youth are increasing, and they need to also plan for them, and we need to create interventions that will enable them to have some sort of of resilience and contribute to economic development. Yes, I think that is it in a nutshell. Thank you very much, and over to you, Alvin.
Thank you very much, Huntington, for that submission. It has been very enlightening. I think now I can go over to you, Enoch, to also give us a view of how you look at Uganda's economy today.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see the screen.
All right, that's great. Presenting the state. Oh, great. I'm presenting the state of Uganda's economy before, during, and after COVID-19, and grateful to the Open Economics Uganda Forum for inviting me, and I'm glad to meet you all virtually. Can you see that next slide on the context? I've moved to the second slide. Can you see it?
I think, yes, everything is clear.
All right, great. So, okay, great. So by way of context, by way of introduction, I want to start with this statement that it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And to the Christians, you know that it's Jesus who said that. And for us to know the state of Uganda's economy, we need to know whether we are healthy or we are sick. And so to understand the performance of the economy, we can look at it from a macro perspective, that's at an aggregate level, or at a micro perspective, or using a micro lens, where we're looking at the individual components that make up the economy. And in most cases, we use indicators that will help us to in the next slides. But what we have come to learn as economists and students of economics is that we are overly concerned with the macro indicators, and this is partly influenced by the politicians or the political leaders who are interested in the big things, and they communicate to the masses that we're going to shift our GDP from this level to this level, and people like such information. And so the media is quick to pick on that, and of course it affects the appreciation of economics even by the common man. But micro indicators which are overlooked are equally relevant. And relatedly, we observe that traditional indicators such as GDP, the unemployment rate, the inflation are also prioritized over the non-traditional indicators, such as time use, the happiness indices, which help us to tell whether how happy people are, corruption indices, and other governance and institutional indicators, such as the rule of law. Then there are things that we cannot measure accurately, and which are equally important, but we don't consider them in contemporary macroeconomics. So this talk is relevant because we're trying to look at the state of Uganda's economy today, but to have a good understanding of that, we need to know where we've come from, where we are at the present, and where we are going. And that's what I call the before COVID, that's BC, during COVID, DC, and then after COVID. So starting from the GDP, which helps us to measure the performance of economy, which is the commonly used indicator, we observe that Uganda's GDP has fluctuated over years. That's the growth, pardon me. The growth has fluctuated over years, and before COVID-19, from 2009-10 to 2018-19, it was about, on average, our economy grew at 7%. But during COVID, we observed that there is a decline in economic performance from 6.4% in 2018-19 to 3.0%. And now, most commentators on this will actually speak that COVID is the cause of this, that we had reduction in public investment, that's by the government, but also households and farms and businesses were unable to invest because of the lockdown, like Huntington has already hinted on that, because of the containment measures that were put in place by the government. So we see the economy rebounding in 2021 to about 3.4%, which is a good thing. But again, I think Huntington raised pertinent issues about inclusion. How inclusive is this growth that we're witnessing in the economy? And is it job creating? And this he spoke about. Then the second thing we want to interest ourselves is the inflation. How have prices, the general price level been changing over years? And you can observe from the trend that before 2013, we actually had relatively high inflation. And I think the 2011 scenario was explained mainly by the elections, and some of you could have heard about some excess money in the economy. I think you know the means, how it got there. But during COVID, we see that inflation still picks up, and this picking up of inflation could be explained by the, again, shortfalls in supply, partly because of the restrictions, but also the productive capacity of individuals was affected, in that they couldn't produce as much as they would produce, given the restrictions, given the movement restrictions by the government. We still have the curfew right now, and all those have a bearing on the ability of the suppliers to actually put goods on the market. And we also know that right now there's a lot of domestic borrowing by the government. It could also partly explain the increase in the prices. Thirdly, we would want to look at the fiscal policy. How is the fiscal health of our country? As you observe from the trend, is that Uganda's revenues and expenditures have been increasing over time, but the increase in expenditures far exceeds the increase in the revenues. And what that results into is a deterioration in the primary balance, which is the deficit. In other words, as a country, we are spending more than we actually earn in terms of domestic revenues, but also in form of grants. And of course, during COVID-19, we see that actually the gap between our revenues as a country that we mobilize and our spending needs increased. So what that means is that government has to close that gap by borrowing more. Borrowing from the domestic economy, but also borrowing from multilateral institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank, and borrowing from countries such as China. But interestingly, as an economy, I beg your pardon, as a country, we are signatory to the East African Monetary Union Protocol, which is aimed at establishing a single currency. And as a country, we committed ourselves that by 2020-21, we should have our deficit to GDP ratio that's at 3%. So you can observe that from the time we signed to this accord in 2013 in November, you can observe the trend over time. We were close to it in 2016-17, but then again, we shot up from 2017. And you can see that in the year of COVID, the deficit actually increased further to about 8%. Now, of course, there is a possibility for us to blame it on COVID, but we must understand that there are existing risks in Uganda's fiscal system, or in the way we plan for the finances we mobilize and use. But also there are political economic concerns. As you know, the creation of more districts, creation of more spending units, all these factors explain the sharp increase in Uganda's deficit. And we know that the government is actually planning to create more cities. However, this is not informed by the availability of revenues. So we need to be concerned. Now, government projects that this target will be met by 2025-26. It's good to be hopeful. but let's wait and see how it will turn out. Then earlier I talked about the deficit. So if we have a deficit in terms of our deficit in terms of the revenues and expenditures gap, we have to close that deficit. How? By borrowing. And as you can see, our debt has grown from 1.8 trillion in 1990-91 to about 67 trillion. Now, of course, it looks like it's a very small thing, but it's actually a lot of money that we have to pay back. And the growth in the debt in itself is not a bad thing. But if this debt that you're accumulating is not helping you to create sustainable growth, to create more opportunities, to be to enable people to participate more in their economy, then it's not benefiting you as a country. And this should be a cause of concern, because it pulls away, because we have to meet our debt obligations, we have to spend more on repaying the debt and paying the interest and principal of the debt. And that means that we have limited resources to cater for other necessities or social service sectors such as education and the health sector. And Huntington talked about their importance in his presentation. How is Uganda performing against the target in the East African Monetary Union Protocol? Again, we're well below the target, but it doesn't mean that everything is good. There are other costs that come with accumulating more debt. Then looking at the external sector in terms of our trade, in terms of exports and imports, we observe that during this time, if you look at the COVID period, we see that there's a decline in both our exports or our export revenues, or how much we've earned from exporting, and also how much we import. But you can observe that the deficit has increased, which signifies that as a country, even in COVID, we continue to depend more on imports, even amidst interventions by government to have import replacement as a key strategy. As a country, we are still importing more because there are certain products or services that we need as a country, but we're still unable to produce them at the quality that is required, but also in the amounts that are demanded. Then how about employment? Huntington spoke about this, but we can observe from this table 1, maybe employment population ratio is basically about among the available people who are available to work, how many of these, how many people are actually willing to absorbed in the economy, or to participate in the economy. So from the residents' perspective, we observe that actually the employment to population ratio is higher in the urban area, which can indicate that more people in urban areas are able to find employment than those in the rural areas. And then with a particular interest in youth, we find that more males are participating in the economy than the women. Again, we'll see what could partly explain this. And then looking at the sectors of economy, we still see that majority of Ugandans are employed in the agriculture, forestry, and fishing sector. That's about 68%, while services, which follows closely, is at 23.9%, and the production, which represents the construction industry, is at 7.2%. And of course, there's a massive push for industrialization, to have a move of Ugandans from agriculture to industry through programs such as the agro-industrialization program of the National Development Plan. How are we faring in terms of poverty and inequality? Now, we can see that in the past, there have been efforts by government to reduce the number of people that are below the poverty line. And you can observe that we had a reduction in the poverty head count from 56.4 to 21.4%. But during COVID, government reports that actually that ratio declined. But again, we can't be so comfortable because anything could happen. A minute. Sorry about that. Anything could happen. In other words, you could have a reverse in these gains in reducing poverty. In terms of inequality, which helps us to know the distribution of income across different people in terms of incomes, we observe that Uganda's income inequality over time has been increasing, but the recent statistics indicate that there is now a fairer distribution of incomes across the different segments of the economy. But COVID-19 is likely to reverse these gains because of some of the restrictions, most particularly the one on training. Schools are still closed, especially this primary, secondary schools. Some tertiary institutions have been opened, but again, if what feeds into the university system is still under lock, how do you expect us to have the kind of population, the quality, the required quality that will help us to sustainably drive growth in this country? So this is something that government needs to critically look into. Reopening of schools, all schools actually, not just a few. All schools are important. Then how much time? This is another indicator that we don't usually pay attention to in mainstream economics. But how much time do we spend on activities, different activities? We observe that about men spend more time in productive work than women. Relatedly, women spend about 6 hours in doing unpaid, in doing unpaid care work, which is work done at home in terms of looking after children, looking after the other members of the family. The more you have women engage in this unpaid care work, results in less time spent on employment activities because they have to bear the large burden of looking after households and making sure that everything at home is in order. So there is a need for government to actually, and different leaders at different levels, including the traditional leaders, the religious leaders, to push for more redistribution of this unpaid care work, but also for having men and young men, boys, and being encouraged to engage in this work, because in the long term, it will help us to ensure that we have an equal society in terms of access to employment opportunities, but also contribution to economic growth, because the kind of work that is done at homes is actually not reflected in our GDP figures or other indicators of economic performance. Then in terms of unpaid care work, again, this using the recent UBO statistics, we observe that more women than men are engaged in unpaid care work. How about after COVID? Perhaps some of you might be wondering, how come he's not speaking about that? Well, the COVID scenario is very hard to predict, honestly, because of the fact that COVID is still with us. Some of us had thought that perhaps by 2021, we should have returned to normalcy, but things have turned out differently. And what this means is that even the predictions by the authorities, such as the Ministry of Finance, are very unstable. And as you can see in this graph, for instance, looking at the deficit rule, Uganda projected in June 2020 that we shall have our deficit to GDP ratio at about 3%. But that was in the budget. But in the third development plan, this was a bit revised. And you see the same revision in June 2021, government signaling that we're actually unlikely to meet this deficit target by 2024-25, but we shall meet it in 2025-26. Then in September 2021, just a few months, government revises that again from 2.3% to 3%, again reflecting the increasing uncertainty. Now, if the future is not different from the past, things could likely get worse in terms of our poverty statistics, in terms of inequality, in terms of even growth. So there's a need for the government to revise some of its approaches to providing sustainable employment to the youth, as Hannington mentioned. So COVID gives us an opportunity to rethink our approach to economics and development. And I would like to us to think about this, that we can never have the Ugandan economy that we want if we don't have the Ugandans that we want. So there is a need for the government to invest in its people through investing in the health systems or sector, skilling of youth and education. Hannington spoke about this greatly, and then social protection as well. Conclusion about the state of Uganda's economy: there's a slowdown in the pace of economic. There is likely to be a slowdown in the pace of economic growth. Prices are likely to increase further, and employment. This might sound like it's a bit pessimistic, but it's until government makes a strong case in its investment by prioritizing the key sectors that some of these things will likely turn out to be worse. So we're also likely to see an increase in the budget deficit, because our spending is not informed by the available revenues, but it is informed by other expectations. Then I would like to propose that if we are to look ahead, then we must rely on both the fiscal policy and the monetary policy by supporting livelihoods, and focusing on economic growth. And borrowing these words from one of Uganda's, globally, a renowned educationist, Mr. Patrick Bakamale, the late, as a country, we must do the right things that count when it counts. We must put our money where we are sure as a country that we shall have greater returns, and we must focus on the roots and not the fruits. In other words, we must put in place the investments that are required to get us to where we want to be. And then moments constitute seasons, and seasons constitute a lifetime, which means that we must use this COVID period to rethink our approach to economics and development. And then a point to ponder for the audience: is COVID-19 a scapegoat for the state of Uganda's economy? Everyone seems to point to COVID for anything that is not turning out right. COVID is to blame. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Enoch, for that extensive overview of the Ugandan economy. I'd like to ask the audience, you can put forward questions in the chat. We'll get to them in a few minutes. I think I'll just put forward just a few questions, like two to the panelists, then we can go to those questions from the audience because we are running out of time, and then we'll have a closing statement. So we've had your views on the economy, talking about financial inclusion, employment, social inclusion, the GDP, and all that. My first question would be, looking at all this and also factoring in the effects of COVID-19, and looking at the interventions that government has put in place, how effective have these interventions been? Looking at how Enoch has said that we are not very sure of how this is going to turn out, and many reviews have been made of what expectations are for this. How effective are the measures that government have put in place to enable economic recovery, and have there been any impact in terms of how you see the things moving now? I think I'll put this to Enoch.
All right, I'm already unmuted. Yeah, I would think that government interventions in terms of supporting households through the cash relief and food relief have had a small effect. I know there are households that were really unable to meet their daily expenses. So the cash was helpful, but also there are households that were food insecure at that time. So the food that they received was really much needed. The only challenge with that is that the targeting was not rightly done. In his presentation, Huntington talked about the aspect of inclusiveness in interventions. You might find that people who benefited from some of these interventions were actually not the right people who needed them. Again, questioning government's ability to locate the people that need the kind of support that they received, and then ensure that they actually receive it. We have issues about openness that and transparency in these measures that, again, causes us to ponder whether government really had an interest at heart. Then if you look at other interventions, such as the employment interventions in terms of putting in place the EMIOGA program, we see that number of reports of course, people received the money, but some of that money was actually diverted to other things. Now that affects the ability of such a good plan to have the intended impact. Then lastly, we see that these measures were just relief, and in the language of the medical people, is that this was just palliative care, trying to provide some relief, but they were not having a strong transformative lens. How, like Huntington talked about resilience, are these interventions able to build the resilience of households? I doubt it.
Just a small follow-up. There have been also measures taken by Bank of Uganda trying to intervene to make sure that banks negotiate extension of loans for businesses. I think last year some taxes were deferred to a later date. We've seen some money that was put aside in Uganda Development Bank to support businesses in particular key sectors, and the aim for all this is to make sure that we kickstart the economy. We put some money into the economy to kickstart it, especially on the business side. What is your view on those interventions, and maybe a few more that I may not have mentioned?
Putting money in the Uganda Development Bank and Uganda Development Corporation was a very good idea, because the aim was to channel it to interventions such as import replacement and also export promotion. Now, some businesses have received the money, but my interaction with, I happened to have to do some survey with the PRC on that, and we found that there were delays. Actually, when you make the application for this money, and you're a business person, usually you want to receive the money in time so that you're able to execute your plan. But there are delays to release this money. So by the time it comes in, it has already, well, it can still do the purpose, but it can't do much, right? And then we talked about the interventions by the Bank of Uganda. Now, the rescheduling was a good idea, and I think actually the government revised it. It was supposed to end in April, and then they revised it further to April. Then they increased 6 more months. So again, allowing some room for liquidity, and I think it worked out well. Just that the issue of reducing the central bank rate to inform the commercial banks on what rate to charge on loans isn't that channel seems to be weak. We see that commercial banks are not responsive, right? So we have the Bank of Uganda putting in place this rate, expecting the commercial banks to follow suit, but they don't. And I do not know whether we need to have a stronger system that actually sees the commercial banks respond. Of course, they have other challenges, or they have other costs to operate in their operations that affect the lending rates that they charge. But we must come to a place where we see them respond, at least when government is trying to signal that they should reduce, they should follow suit, but it rarely happens. Yeah. So I think.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think Huntington also has a follow-up on that question.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Enoch, for your earlier presentation and responding to these questions. I think when it comes to the issue of those government interventions where there was a moratorium on interest payments for businesses, and also the fund or the relief fund that was put in UDB, my challenge, or the challenge that I saw, was mainly with the trickle-down effect. When there was when there was a moratorium on interest payments on loans in the banks, we did not see that happening a lot when it came down to the other people. I'll give you an example. Like, for example, the first lockdown of around 6 months, when the sellers or the business owners downtown eventually went back to work, they were requested, or they were asked to pay a full amount of their rent, even for the months that they were not working. So what that shows you is that the structuring of the moratorium was not intended to trickle down to the last business owner. And I think the effectiveness and the impact was then minimized, because at the end of the day, it is the building owner or the larger business owner that actually ended up benefiting from the moratoriums. And it's the same applies for the relief funds that were put in the development banks and by BOE, by government. And even in this financial year, the government announced over 200 billion shillings for relief. And it is very unfortunate that we are in the second quarter of the new financial year and we are yet to realize or to see the impact of that fund. The way funds are being disbursed, like Enoch said, the timeliness is very alarming, because if I have a plan to execute today, I have to go through as many hoops that will take me around 2 months. So by that time, my reason or the impact that fund will do for my business has already done what? Has already lapsed. So I think it came down to the interventions. Some of the interventions that the government, of course, the COVID relief food and the funds, despite the challenges, had some impact. But this other part of the relief funds and the moratorium on interest payments, I think that did not have its intended impact. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Huntington. And I think I would also want to put a question to you. You talked about financial inclusion, you talked about unemployment. And when you look at the Ugandan economy, when you look at the issue of unemployment, one of the problems that we're facing is that starting businesses by young people is very difficult. And one of the challenges is access to finance. And access to finance is limited by the high interest rates that we've talked about, because banks view individuals, Uganda as a very risk economy. Also, Enoch talked about banks not responding to Bank of Uganda when by not lowering the interest rates and stuff like that. How do you think, what other measures do you think government can put in place to make sure that there is access to finances by young people, and what other interventions can be made to ensure that?
Thank you very much. So I think the issue of access to capital is, or access to credit is really complex. When you look at the commercial banks not responding to the CBR, whatever it reduces, the idea is like I've been talking about, the reduction should trickle down to the what? To the borrower. But the challenge that the commercial banks, and I'm speaking from my observation, it's not, I don't speak for all of them. From my observation, I think the challenge is with the riskiness of the what? Of the borrowers. Banks, you'll find that banks or commercial banks are very willing, able, happy, and eager to lend government money because they know the government, of course, eventually will pay back the money and all, than lending to individuals, because the commercial banks in Uganda consider Ugandans, or a bigger part of the Ugandans, also even the youth that we are talking about, they consider them risky clients. And the banks by nature are risk averse. So now I think I have two ideas. One is, of course, to how do we de-risk? Now we need to have a different conversation on how do we de-risk either startup businesses or the youth themselves that want to get money to do what? To start these businesses. And then when we have finished finding a solution or some sort of way that we can improve, or we can de-risk the loan seekers, then we can also move on to the ways of how credit is accessed. Right now, we have a the access to credit providers, or the providers of credit, are very limited. So you have people like the commercial banks who have the bulk of the money, but then who else is there to bridge that gap of providing capital? So it becomes a challenge. And so we need to also see, maybe through innovation, through partnerships, providing grants. I know there are some people that are already doing those kind of partnerships. So I know MasterCard is doing something like that, where they invest in where they invest in startup businesses, more so by the youth. So we need to de-risk the clients, and then we need to create innovation and more avenues through which credit can be accessed. And the credit to be accessed should be flexible and cheap. I want to emphasize that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huntington. I see we are running out of time. I see the very few questions. I don't see much of questions coming through, but more of comments. I'll pick a few comments and read them out as we conclude. So Francis Sentongo says, mine is just an appreciation. I'm an engineer without a background in any business studies, but everything you pointed out is clear and precise, as well as understandable. I'm having a good time. Thank you. Also, Ronald Kasaija says, thank you for the presentation, Enoch and Huntington. My contribution goes straight to the issue of economic growth. Like you said, most of the government interventions have failed to have an impact due to the fact money is always diverted. The Keynesian view of government intervention also needs to be revised. Does it actually affect growth? To be specific, do we need to increase government expenditure or reduce it to affect growth? And I also see here that Ronald Kasaja goes again to say the issue of the CBR is actually mainly to the effect of macroeconomic stability. This has been achieved, although lending rates are still high. In terms of inflation, with core inflation around 3.5%, there is need to look at the cost of banks, the cost banks face, which could be a major factor in influencing banks' lending rates, especially since we have majorly foreign-owned banks. Yes. Tamale Brian says, my appreciation goes to you all, and especially to the panelists. Mine is, why do these interventions fail to level? I think this is a question. Why do these interventions fail to the levels they do, yet they are designed to affect the current situations at the different points in time. In other words, the intervention should be helping, but yet are not. So I think it's also a comment, but posed in a question form. In the interest of time, I think I would like to appreciate all of you for joining us, and thank you for taking off your time to participate in this discussion. I would like to give a special appreciation to the panelists, Hannington and Enoch, for the very insightful discussion that you enabled us have. Thank you very much. So for those that would be willing to, those that are interested in interacting with Open Economics Uganda, you can reach us through our email at uganda@rethinkingeconomics.org. I think I'll put the email in the chat. You can copy it, reach us, we can have a discussion on any issue. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a blessed day. Thank you.